Our second paper for this session is from Selwyn Cornish, who is the Reserve Bank of Australia's official historian, and he gave a great paper last year on the history of the founding of the Reserve Bank that turned into a wonderful chapter in the Menzies Ascendancy, particularly the letters that were exchanged between Menzies and Fadden, sort of debating that policy. They really, really expose what went into decision-making during the Menzies era. And now we move on to another very important decision in the decision to introduce decimal currency. Thanks.
Well, as Zach mentioned, my paper discusses the adoption of decimal currency by Australia in February 1966 and the involvement of Sir Robert Menzies. Menzies' role in the decision has usually been ignored or held up to ridicule. It's often thought that he regretted the decision to replace the imperial currency system by the decimal system, deciding, as he did, to retire 3 weeks before it was introduced. John Howard, in his biography of Menzies, wrote that, and I quote, "In a neat piece of symbolism, Australia began using decimal currency on 14 February 1966, just 3 weeks after Holt became PM. Holt," Howard continued, quote, "did not possess that instinctive Britishness that was a natural part of Menzies' makeup." When consideration is given to Menzies' role in the adoption of decimal currency, the issue that's usually highlighted is the government's initial decision to call the major unit of the new currency the Royal. This is usually attributed to Menzies and his devotion to the royal family. Boris Shedvin, for example, in his history of the Reserve Bank, stated that Menzies, quote, "was coy about his involvement in the selection, but there is no doubt that the choice was his." John Murphy, the Reserve Bank's art curator, in an article marking the 50th anniversary of the introduction of decimal currency, asserted that, and I quote, "For the Prime Minister, Robert Menzies, who was a renowned monarchist, the change to decimal currency was softened by the initial decision to call the new unit of currency the Royal." My paper challenges these assertions, as I'll explain shortly. Support in Australia for the adoption of decimal currency has a long history. In fact, the first Commonwealth Parliament established a select committee of the House of Representatives in June 1901, just a couple of months after the establishment of the Federation, to investigate and report on the merits of decimal currency. The committee recommended its adoption, which was endorsed by the House in 1903. The House of Representatives passed another motion in 1904 supporting the introduction of decimal currency. The Imperial Conference in London in 1907 debated an Australian-inspired motion to introduce decimal currency across the entire British Empire. Andrew Fisher, the Australian Prime Minister, announced in 1910 that he favoured the adoption of decimal currency, and another Imperial Conference in 1911 discussed a further proposal by Australia supporting the introduction of decimal currency. In addition, the important Royal Commission into the Australian monetary and banking systems recommended in its report in 1937 that the imperial system be replaced by the decimal system. The major argument against the introduction of decimal currency was that Australia could not or should not make the change before the UK adopted decimal currency. Support for retaining the imperial system was due in part to tradition and sentiment for the mother country, But there was also a significant economic consideration, given that Australia's major trading and financial links were predominantly with Britain. It was contended that changing to decimal currency before Britain would complicate and indeed could jeopardise these powerful economic and financial connections. As to the Royal Commission's recommendation, when Menzies was first Prime Minister and Treasurer, he was asked a question in the Parliament in June 1939 by Walter Nairn, the member for Perth. Nairn asked Menzies, as Treasurer, whether he had considered the Royal Commission's support for decimal currency and whether he would ask the Treasury to survey the situation to see whether it would be practicable to introduce a system of decimal currency in Australia. Menzies replied that he had not yet considered the matter, but he would be, quote, very glad to have the Treasury examine it, with a view to enabling the government to announce its position when the House reassembled after the forthcoming recess. Of course, a few months later, Australia was at war with Germany, and changing the nation's currency system was obviously not an urgent matter. From the mid-1950s, there was increasing pressure in Australia to change to decimal currency, and there were several reasons for this. By the 1950s, nearly 90% of the world's population were living in countries with decimal currency. Britain, together with the British Dominions, excluding Canada, and the British colonies, were the major exceptions. But an important turning point occurred in April 1957 when India changed to decimal currency. South Africa and Pakistan were starting to move in the same direction. New Zealand was beginning to discuss the possibility of changing to decimal currency. Even in the UK, there was a growing discourse on the merits of decimal currency. Moreover, Australian trade and overseas investment in Australia were no longer dominated by Britain. Japan, the US, and continental Europe were developing closer economic ties with Australia. Increasing numbers of immigrants were coming to Australia from continental Europe, and they were more familiar with the decimal system than with the imperial system. And electronic accounting devices, calculating machines, cash registers, and other vending machines were now being imported with in greater volume from North America and continental Europe. And they had to be converted to the imperial system at considerable expense. In these circumstances, there were increasing calls to change the Australian currency system. In 1957, a private organisation, the Decimal Currency Council, was established here in Melbourne under the chairmanship of Sir Leslie Melville, the Vice-Chancellor of the ANU. The council used its impressive membership, predominantly business enterprises, to lobby the government. In January 1958, the government began to consider the establishment of a new Royal Mint in Canberra, agreeing that the changeover to decimal currency was inevitable. The government also began to consider the appointment of a committee to advise it on how to prepare for the introduction of decimal currency. But the pivotal moment was Menzies' policy speech in October 1958, ahead of the November 1958 general election. In his policy speech, Menzies announced that the government, quote, accept the principle of decimal currency, and if re-elected, it would, quote, set up an independent committee to advise how and when and on what terms to effect this reform. Menzies expressed no regret or nostalgia about the intended demise of the imperial system of pounds, shillings and pence. Having secured a decisive victory at the 1958 election, the new Treasurer, Harold Holt, announced in February 1959 that the government would establish a decimal currency committee of 7 members. Walter Scott, the CEO of Walter Scott Business Consultants, was appointed chairman. Dr. Neil Davey, a Treasury officer who had recently completed a doctorate at the London School of Economics on the discussions and proposals in Britain throughout the 19th century concerning the creation of a decimal currency system, was named as secretary. At Menzies' specific insistence, a woman was appointed to the committee. Alderman Dorothy Edwards, an alderman of the Launceston City Council, an economist trained at the University of Tasmania and the London School of Economics, and a former president of the National Council of Women. The committee's terms of reference included advice to the government on the advantages and disadvantages of decimal currency, how the costs of the changeover to the new currency system could be minimised, the estimated cost of replacing or adapting accounting, calculating, vending and similar machines, and other costs likely to be experienced in the changeover to decimal currency. The committee submitted its report to the government in August 1960. It recommended the adoption of a decimal system with the new currency based on 10 shillings and not on the pound or 20 shillings. It also proposed that the commencement date for the decimal system should be early 1963. However, progress was slow to begin with, due in large measure to the recession of 1960-61. But with recovery now underway, Holt announced in April 1963 that the government had accepted the recommendations of the Decimal Currency Board Committee, and it would create a new statutory authority, the Decimal Currency Board, to undertake the planning and technical work required, including the production of coins and currency notes. A new commencement date of 14 February 1966 was announced. Now, while it's true that Menzies was not involved himself in the management of the conversion process, after all, he was the Prime Minister and he had many other things to do, his announcement that the government accept the principle of decimal coinage proved to be the major turning point, as had been his decisive change of mind in early 1957 regarding the separation of the commercial and central banking functions of the Commonwealth Bank. Once Menzies announced the coalition's commitment to decimal currency in October 1958, the focus of attention then turned to operational considerations, including how the units of the new currency would relate to those of the existing system, whether the government would compensate owners of existing business machines, the names and designs of the new currency notes and coins, and the date for the commencement of decimal currency. Regarding the choice of Royal as the name for the major decimal currency unit, I've not been able to find in the Cabinet records, or elsewhere for that matter, any evidence suggesting that Menzies insisted on that name. There were 4 Cabinet meetings that discussed the name. At the first meeting on the 21st of May 1963, there was a brief discussion. Various names were canvassed, but no decision was made. More time was spent discussing possible names at the second Cabinet meeting on the 5th of June 1963. Menzies is quoted in the minutes as saying that he, quote, he began with a predilection for Oster, not Oscar, Oster. But he said that has died. Several ministers supported Royal, including Shane Portridge, Charles Davidson, Alan Fairhall and Gordon Freeth. Alexander Downer Sr. said that he favoured Crown, though otherwise Royal, adding that he was, quote, flat against dollar. William McMahon favoured Crown or Royal in that order. Senator Henty said that he favoured dollar, but Paul Hasluck argued that, quote, dollar prompts too many people to anger. Freeth agreed with Hasluck. The minutes of the meeting suggest that Menzies was favouring pound, thinking that it was understated. Holt, however, thought that calling the major unit pound would create confusion. John McEwen, the Deputy Prime Minister, later recalled that a majority of ministers indicated a preference for pound until they were informed by Holt that pound would create confusion because there would be a transitional period when two different pounds were circulating. One in the old currency worth 20 shillings and the other, the new pound, worth the equivalent of 10 shillings. When announcing the dinner break on the 5th of June, Holt proposed that members would have the opportunity at dinner to, quote, chew over the various names that had been discussed. At 9 p.m, the minutes record that Holt asked members whether they supported Royal, and the answer was yes, full stop. Holt later claimed, and I quote, "We selected Royal because it was distinctive, euphonious, met the technical considerations, and had an interesting historical association with British currency." Regarding the latter point, it appears that the first 10-shilling coin minted in England in 1485 was known as the Royal. There's no mention in the minutes of the meeting on the 5th of June that Menzies spoke in favour of Royal. When Holt announced after the meeting on the 5th of June that the major unit in the new currency would be called the Royal, there was immediate and widespread public criticism, including strong criticism from the Labor opposition, whose leader, Arthur Calwell, declared that Labor would change the name to dollar at the first opportunity. As a result of the criticism, Cabinet at its meeting on the 25th of July decided to abandon Royal, though some members wanted, quote, to weather the storm and stick to Royal. After it was agreed to abandon Royal at the meeting on the 25th of July, Menzies proposed that Cabinet should delay making a final decision on a replacement name for Royal until ministers were able to consult with coalition MPs, stressing as he did that the government should, quote, not make too much of it, and insisting, quote, that we don't die on the barricades on this. We meet the party and handle it in a matter-of-fact way. It was also important, Menzies emphasised, that the party meeting was held, quote, before the House meets, that is, before the opposition can get in command of the field. Holt, however, questioned the idea of waiting for the party, claiming that the selection of a name for the new currency unit was a matter, quote, for our consideration, for Cabinet's consideration, and not theirs, that is to say, the party's. It was clear to him, and this is quote Holt, it was clear to him that, quote, we misjudged the acceptability of Royal, and our name now is to admit it and change. But Cabinet agreed with Menzies' proposal not to make a final decision on a replacement for Royal until party MPs were consulted. The decision on the name was then delayed until the middle of September 1963, and when Cabinet met on the 17th of September, members agreed that it would not be possible to sustain the name Royal, in part because of public opposition, but also because of, quote, the likely inability on the part of the government to carry the name in the Parliament when the legislative stages are reached. The minutes of the meeting on the 17th of September state that Cabinet, quote, felt that the choice for a substitute name lay only between pound and dollar, and in view of the practical difficulties previously mentioned by the Treasurer surrounding pound and the evident public support for dollar, the name dollar should now be adopted. Holt is reported as saying that there was, quote, no doubt that the overwhelming public and business and press supported dollar. He admitted that, and I quote again, personally, he preferred something else, but we must face public opinion. And if Cornwall moves for dollar in the House, we wouldn't hold our numbers. The minutes of the meeting on the 17th of September suggest that Menzies' endorsement of dollar was the result of a process of elimination. It was clear to him that there was little support for a local name, Oster, for example. There was only sketchy, his word, sketchy support for Royal, leaving the final choice between pound and dollar. And since pound was ruled out on various grounds, that left dollar. He is reported as saying at the meeting that Royal was, quote, up against the parliamentary situation and we can't resist dollar. But having said that, he proposed once more that we should ask the party to reject it, dollar, or approve it. And at the party meeting the following day, the 18th of September, it was agreed that dollar be adopted. To conclude, there's the question whether Menzies' decision to retire 3 weeks before the changeover to decimal currency was motivated by a sense of regret that Australia was abandoning the imperial system. I've not been able to find any evidence suggesting that Menzies chose to retire when he did because of the decision to abandon the imperial currency system. His biographers have generally endorsed the reasons that Menzies himself gave at the time for his decision to retire. Alan Martin, in his biography of Menzies, Alan Martin, in his biography of Menzies, repeats what Menzies said at his final press conference, namely that he was 71 and tired. An election was due late in 1966, and even if he won it, he could not promise that he would serve out the full ensuing term. Better to retire then, while he was still in full possession of his powers, and to allow his successor time to establish leadership in his own right before facing the electors. Troy Bramston, in his biography of Menzies, quotes the minutes of Menzies' final cabinet meeting when he said, and I quote, "To tackle another election, a further period in government is not my intention. My time to go is now, so that a new leader may have the better part of 12 months in order to exhibit his character and the character of his government." According to Bramston, it was during the lead up to the half-Senate election on the 5th of December 1964 that Menzies actually decided to retire. Menzies himself explained that, and I quote, "I went around, I knew my time was running out on me because I was tired, got easily tired, didn't feel any zip when I was at a meeting." He said later, and I quote again, "I then made up my mind that I ought to give it away. And why not? I had an uncommonly good run. I had no grievances about politics." So just finally, contrary to the view expressed by some that the post-war governments led by Sir Robert Menzies achieved little of substance, two of the more significant changes in the monetary and financial structure of Australia came about because of Menzies' personal input. The separation in 1960 of the commercial and central banking functions of the Commonwealth Bank, leading to the creation of the Reserve Bank of Australia, and the change in the country's currency system in 1966 from the imperial system of pounds, shillings and pence to the decimal system of dollars and cents.
That was great. Thanks, Selwyn. Anyone with young children will be able to tell you that because of the cultural dominance of Bluey, it's dollar buck that's the new term that everyone's using in the playgrounds around Australia. Any questions? George? Trish first.
I've got a hearing problem, so you might have to help me with the questions.
Sure.
Mr. Cornish, congratulations on that paper. I think that was an exemplary paper. I really want to congratulate you very warmly for your thoroughness.
Thank you.
It strikes me that the relevant cabinet meetings in 1963 were all before the 1963 election, which I think it was the end of November that year. So Menzies was dealing with his one-seat majority that he had inherited from the 1961 election. When you say the issue of the name was taken to the party room and the conclusion was drawn that the government may not be able to get the legislation through the parliament, that tells me that there must have been at least one, if not more than one, pretty determined backbench rebel who was threatening to cross the floor. Do we know who that was?
That's interesting. And I don't fully understand this. Yeah, you may understand it better than me. But there was a reference to the fact that the party would not insist on party discipline so far as the vote was concerned. I think that was made clear to the coalition members well beforehand.
Was there a conscience though?
Yes, yeah. Because there was such a variety of views on the issue, and I think Menzies. I mean, as I said at the conference last year on the separation of the Commonwealth Bank's central banking and commercial banking functions, that Menzies seemed to be very acute to maybe thinking back to 1940-41. He was very conscious of possible splits on important issues. And I think this was coming through too, and perhaps motivated the desire not to have strict discipline on the party when it came to the names.
Thank you. As you observed in the beginning of your talk, there are many historical documents and kind of books and writings about this period that have made the assumption that Menzies did indeed insist on the title royal. In your investigation, have you managed to uncover any reasons or any theories as to why this thing that you've just shown to be incorrect has propagated in this way?
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting question. I have not found any documents, and I've been through the cabinet documents and I've read them and reread them and reread them. Not once did Menzies support royal or indicate that he supported royal. Other members did, other cabinet members did, but Menzies didn't. I mean, he had that throwaway line. I don't know. There was a desire, and I think Holt had emphasised this, that there was a desire among some members to try and find an Australian name. And that's the Auster, A-U-S-T-E-R. That was going through the Treasury records. I came across a document, I think it was 4 or 5 pages long, 3 columns per page of different names that have been submitted to the Treasury as possible names for the new currency. And a lot of them were, you know, Australian type names, including Quid and Bluey and Digger and so on. Kangaroo and emu, you could imagine, you know, thanks very much. That'll be 4 kangaroos and 3 emus. But no, I couldn't. I think that the second part of the question, you know, royal, monarchy and so on, that sounds like Menzies. It must have been him. I mean, finished up Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Melbourne University, Boris Shedvin, in his history of the Reserve Bank, you know, I quoted it, saying, you know, Menzies was coy about it, but it was certainly him that came up, well, sorry, no records that I've seen support that at all.
Thank you, Colin Milner from ANU. Just a couple of observations on which you might want to comment. One is that it occurs to me that the UK, of course, kept the pound when it turned to decimal currency and kept it at the value that it was previously, and then subdivided it into 100 pence, as I understand it, which was interesting in the light of what you said about Holt's views and so on. And the other point is, I recall reading that the term, one of the prominent options for a name was actually Austral, but it was ridiculed in the press because in Australian parlance it would soon have been described as an nostril. So did you come across that in the cabinet discussions, or is that really a press thing?
The microphone. Yeah. So can you use the microphone? Please?
Sorry, yes, I mean, there were these sorts of names that were being offered. Of course, when the UK introduced decimal currency, which was 1971, it stuck to pound, and also it based the new pound on 20 shillings. This was one of the debates in Australia too. I mean, for example, the Commonwealth Bank, which was then the central bank when this was being discussed, wanted 20 shillings to be the basis. But but 20 shillings would have meant that 1 cent was equal to 2.4 pence in the old currency, whereas with 10 shillings, a cent was worth 1.2 pennies. 2.4 pennies was too high, too inflationary, and you would have to have had a half-cent coin, and no one wanted a half-cent coin. South Africa and New Zealand had already determined that they would base their decimal currency on the 10 shillings unit rather than the 20 shillings unit. And Coombs, the governor of the Commonwealth Bank, said, look, we prefer 20 shillings for various technical reasons, but we can live with 10 shillings. So the bank didn't kick up a fuss about it. But the Decimal Currency Committee came out in favour of 10 shillings, and the government accepted that.
So what was the experience in the UK? Was it inflationary in the UK when they used 20 shillings?
Yes, well, I think that, by 1971, inflation was well and truly underway, and it wasn't. I mean, if Australia had left it a bit later, the issue that I was explaining wouldn't have been such a great issue. But we're talking about the late 50s, early 60s, and inflation was very moderate at that time. Oh, sorry. Yes, I was just saying that when Britain went decimal, inflation was accelerating pretty rapidly. So the problem of using 20 shillings wasn't a big issue by then, whereas Australia was talking about it in the second half of the 50s when inflation was relatively moderate.
Thanks, Selwyn. We'll wrap it up there to keep